Thanks for joining. First session of Visibility in Action is, well, about to kick off. New thing for me to be doing this, recording this for the world, so expect episode number 1 to be a little bit rusty. And I'm joined by Henry Langston from Ocean Insight, Chief Commercial Officer there. And yeah, let's start by giving you a bit of an introduction, shall we, Henry?
Thanks, Dave. Thanks as well for giving me the opportunity to join you and talk about something that's really important to both of us. In my day job, I lead a sales and marketing team for a technology, engineering, and manufacturing company. We make spectrometers, so complex analytical instruments that analyze samples using the power of light. And we sell to everybody from university professors to Fortune 50 and FTSE 100 companies, part of a large listed UK group called PLC.
Excellent, thanks, Henry. And I'm looking forward to getting into this because we've had a very much account manager and client relationship for a couple of years now. So these are really important topics to kind of get out there and talk about. And actually, you were the first person that came to mind when the project kind of started forming in my mind after recalling the piece you wrote for Halma during Pride Month last year. And I think the events of last year have done so much to bring diversity, inclusion, equity, whatever you want to call it, to the fore, that actually having people tell their stories, it just goes to humanize those experiences. And that's ultimately what we're trying to do. And I think diversity is such a huge topic. It covers so many different things. The best place to start is with what you know. So yeah, I think aim of this conversation today really is just to share some stories, get some conversations going with, a bit of an understanding that people don't know everything. And sometimes they might be a bit wary to ask questions, afraid of being judged. So if we can answer some of those without people having to proactively go seek the information, then I think that should be really useful. And actually from a purely personal perspective, we only know from our own experiences. So I think there's so much I don't know about what happens within the STEM sectors, for people under the LGBTQ plus banner, each different letter, each part of the acronym, everyone's going to have their own experience. There's many people out there who, cover off, intersectionality is the word we use. They cover off lots of different elements of what we might call diversity, and, without ticking boxes, how does that affect them? So there's 2 or 3 things I think we'll focus on today. I am very aware that we could talk for hours and hours and hours about this and more. But where I wanted to start is the idea of kind of coming out and it being seen as this kind of rite of passage that every LGBTQ person has to go through. And it's almost seen as this one kind of lifetime event that you do, and that's you. And in reality, I think we both know that it's almost a daily thing that you have to think about in every new conversation you have. So for me, identifying as bi, that's whether someone, assumes if I'm in a same-sex or opposite sex relationship, that doesn't mean that gets, erased. So in the professional realm, we both have fairly client-facing roles. So how do you think that affects, I suppose, your day-to-day mental health in many ways, in terms of, talking to different people? And actually, in your career, have you seen it have a noticeable effect on whether that's career progression, your comfort, your happiness in a job? How does that affect your day-to-day life, do you think?
Yeah, I think first of all, it's the point that that idea of invisible diversity.
Yes.
And the fact that you don't go around wearing an LGBT label on your forehead for every Zoom call or every
Yes. I mean, it's on my LinkedIn banner, but
Yeah. and so in every relationship you form, in every professional relationship, just as it is in personal relationships, you face the question, and I know I certainly ask myself the question, how much am I comfortable in sharing with this person? Not knowing, especially in a professional context, when you're networking people, meeting clients, meeting people often for the first time,
Yep.
it is about relationship building between, especially with clients. Everybody knows that that's an important part. And so, if you do identify as LGBT, I think it's very unusual if you don't think about that, because you are actively thinking, how do I build a relationship with this person?
Yeah.
How they're going to feel or empathize. And if we, why is it so common to bond with clients socially? Why do you want to take them out for dinner? Why do you want to develop relationships with them?
Mm-hmm.
Talking about children or sports, or those things that become build a sense of common identity between two people. And so that becomes a point of, or a decision for every LGBT person: how much do I feel comfortable sharing? And I think that it does, in some ways, the fact that being a white gay man, you can choose to say it, and it in some ways makes it easier, because you just don't have to think about it. You're just going to talk about the business, what we're here to do. And on the other hand, it's harder because you have to be more conscious and deliberate, and people may also make different assumptions, referring to gender of partners without thinking about it, referring to, why don't you have kids? Those things that can be incredibly confronting, and do make you think about it. I mean, no one's ever asked me that. I do say, people, you question why they might be questioning, and that can very quickly subconsciously create distance in relationships. So you're constantly navigating that. And so what impact does that have on people? What impact does it have on me? To be honest, for me personally, trying to be someone who wants to be a role model or wants to be visible, it's telling myself to be brave enough to be visible.
Yeah, no, completely. But a lot of that is a product of the environment that allows you to be that visible. So I mean, you talk about conversations about, building relationships with people, talking about partners, talking about, kids, all of these kinds of things. And it takes me back to conversations I've had in previous roles where, you come in on a Monday morning, everyone's in the kitchen making their coffee or whatever, talking about what they did at the weekend. And that sense of trying to figure out how open you're going to be based on who's in the room with you is huge. And if that's a weekly, almost daily occurrence, that's a huge impact on how comfortable someone then feels being that role model, being visible. And I think that's where we get onto conversations about how do you build an inclusive culture, things like that. Because if in your role, in your work, you feel sort of included in every other sense, suddenly that becomes much smaller of a barrier to get over, to also then be more open and visible with every other aspect of your life as well.
That's absolutely right, and I think that's as true in STEM environments as in any other. But it is that you have to, even being part of an inclusive culture, as I am, and I'm very happy about that, you still fear it.
You do.
And so that's, I think, the reality that people, I think, we have an open and inclusive culture. Like, Jody in accounting's got a boyfriend. Like, what's the problem?
Yeah.
It's not about that. It's the fact that the culture exists within a broader set of, social and environmental norms of what the workplace is, and how you behave, and what are appropriate topics to talk about, or expectations that people might have of each other in the workplace. And nothing exemplifies it more to me than the office Christmas party or things like that dreaded question, oh, are you bringing someone or something, where I think about for so many people who identify as LGBTQ plus, it's not a question they want to hear. And that to me is a kind of a watershed kind of question. Is this truly an environment or a culture where I feel comfortable?
Yeah.
And even in an environment where my partner has met my colleagues, I'm a leader in the organization, and therefore it's also visible, you still have that gut-wrenching feeling when the question comes up.
Yeah, it's ingrained, through.
Yeah.
No, completely. It's, and I mean, this could get us into so many different areas of conversation. But one thing we've talked about before, hitting record, was, education and upbringing, and this idea that, if you're trying to forge a career in STEM, as an example, it is a traditionally masculine arena, whether that's technology, manufacturing, engineering, all of it. I mean, frankly, everything is traditionally a masculine arena until we start trying to change that. But it's still one of those industries or groups of industries that is seen in that way. So that's where education becomes, hugely important. We, being of a very similar age, grew up at a time through the 90s into the 2000s where there was definite improvements. We by no means grew up with the same stigma that the generations before us did. But at the same time, there was those unwritten rules about what could be said, what couldn't be said, that were frankly written into law in the UK, although they weren't in New Zealand. And I suppose just that is what creates the atmosphere of that gut-wrenching feeling that you talk about, because if one environment that you're in is massively inclusive and you know that and you feel that and you're happy with it, it's within something bigger, and it's kind of the something bigger that needs to be fixed, which is a daunting problem, I suppose.
Yeah, I think that people think about discrimination as the very active and overt act of saying something or expressing a view that might be inappropriate. But I think what people tend to discount is the power of discrimination by omission and the discrimination that silence causes. And because it sustains and supports a culture that makes people feel uncomfortable. And that can be very confronting. And if I talk to any of the people I work with, that would be probably horrifying to think, if they thought that by not saying something against something, at all, because it's just easier to have that, let's call it, blokiness or the stiff upper lip that we tend to have in those masculine dominated cultures, it undermines the sense that it does, whether you like it or not, undermine that tolerance. I think it can be particularly true in STEM environments where you're working with engineering, manufacturing, which have been male dominated for a long time, that it's not seen as something we need to talk about. So therefore we're just kind of just leave it over there and it's fine and people can get on with their life and be who they want to be, but we're just not going to talk about it. And that becomes, people don't realize that how much that perpetuates.
Yeah, I mean, the comparison, I suppose, is don't ask, don't tell, isn't it? That's the environment that builds up, and we've all read in recent years how toxic that can be. I mean, like I said, there's so many different angles we could then take that conversation, but moving into almost building how you build an inclusive culture, particularly in STEM, where particularly if you have a small team as well. I'm sitting here working for a business of 30, 35 people. Which limits the diversity you can have purely by statistics. However, it's an incredibly inclusive group of people considering its size. And I suppose you can be inclusive without being diverse. And I think, from a recruitment perspective, working for a recruitment business, I do get a lot of small businesses that we support talking about, well, is diversity important for us? Because our team is so small, we can't have a big impact? Or how do we attract a non-white male candidate? And I'm very aware we might be talking about LGBTQ issues here, but we are two white English-speaking men. There's a lot of privilege being talked about here as well. But how do we attract people from backgrounds that we don't represent? And that's by being inclusive, which sounds easier than it is in reality. But Ocean and Halma as a wider group is something that you guys have had a lot of focus on over the last few years.
Yeah.
Is it something you can actually put your finger on? Like, how do you start that? Where does it begin?
I think it is a grassroots thing, right? It doesn't come from a top-down announcement and a press release about the fact that we went to Pride and had a flag. It just, the far more important things are how an employee feels coming to work every day and how you are treated and feel part of a team, because community is built on finding those common things that bind us together, whether it's a sales objective, whether it's a shared passion for the purpose of your organization, whether it's a strong belief in the culture and the team that you're part of. And so to get the most out of diverse employees, it's about making sure that their voice and what makes them different is recognized and valued as much as anything. And I think about what does that look like, and some of the formative experiences that I've had. And when I first came to the UK after university in Australia, and I trained as an aerospace engineer, and I obviously, the center of aerospace manufacturing in Derby in the Midlands, in an incredibly white male, quite conservative worldview and social kind of community, working as an intern for a company there in a sales department with a team that were 100% white male, and started every Monday morning talking about fantasy football. And totally normal. But they were a great group of guys, and they made a point to get to know me, to make sure I felt comfortable, and to actually make the point, hey, if anybody gives you any problem, we'll go beat them up.
Maybe not the best response, but yeah.
Which on one hand was
support in the way they knew how.
Really not what you want to happen. But I can tell you what that means is what that was an overt statement of loyalty to you, recognizing your difference. And of course they never actually had to do that, and nobody ever did anything, but it made a huge difference, just the fact that they took an action, inappropriate or not, to make sure I felt comfortable and recognized. And that was my first ever kind of job, and it was in a place where I did feel uncomfortable, because we were working on, this is big gas turbines, lots of overalls and oil and big stuff, and lots of guys with throwing wrenches.
Technical term, that big stuff.
And military projects, guys with uniforms on, and going in and out. It was to do with the aircraft carriers at the time, and that environment is as classically blokish as you can get.
Yeah.
You know what? They full respect to that team and that company, because they weren't going to be putting out a press release about their support for Pride Month, but they lived it, and that really left a mark on me. Yeah. And so coming to Halma and working in Helmer for the past 10 years, it's been important to just try and be comfortable. And I've seen the organization actively make steps to try and make sure that it talks about those issues and creates a way for companies to talk about those issues.
Yeah.
In a way. It's not going to happen overnight, but it does start with those individual decisions that managers, that team members and colleagues make about how you have that conversation on Monday morning.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's, I mean, there's so many different kind of ins and outs of how you go about having those conversations. But like you say, it's about making sure that someone feels comfortable and included. And I think one of the things that you see as an argument, not necessarily against diversity, for want of a better phrase, is the idea that it takes away from what's already there for the majority, as it were. And I think that football conversation is really interesting because it sounds so inane and so nothing. It shouldn't affect anybody. But actually, if every Monday you're in an all-staff meeting, everyone catching up, and the first 20 minutes, that's what it's all about. You're not saying that that's not allowed, but it has to be recognized that it's probably only aimed at 40-50% of the room. And I think it's that recognition that, oh, there's other things we can talk about here. There's other people that might have, interesting things to chat about. And it's, like you said, recognizing people's difference and allowing it to stand out positively rather than being sort of not criticized, but being used as a descriptor. They are, that is our gay employee, for example, or that's the one non-white person in the room. It's respecting difference in a way that allows people to talk about it. And actually that's what humanizes it, isn't it? Because you can be the only LGBTQ person in an organization, but if the organization makes you feel comfortable enough to be visible, just by being visible, you're educating the rest of the team and saying, actually, these relationships are as normal as anybody else's.
Well, and that's how you start to normalize those.
Yeah.
That month, I developed and became a fan of Tottenham FC because you know what, I needed a team, and that stuck. And that's, but at the same time, you get to have a more nuanced and relevant understanding of each other. That drives better relationships, which drives better performance as a business team. And so, if you're not constantly working to be inclusive, it's the same whether it's across whatever minority cultures that may identify, ethnic, cultural background as well, making sure people feel comfortable speaking. It's no different working with LGBT voices in your group and in your room and in your team. And I think that because in STEM, it's about technology, it's about science, it's about these things that are largely somewhat abstracted from human emotion and the personal stuff. It can be extra easy to avoid or not have those conversations. But it's about saying it with a megaphone in the staff meeting or on the all hands call. It can be about the one-to-one conversation you have with a colleague or a team member, after the meeting, or recognizing what you may have seen from social media or things outside of work, just to create an inclusive and positive affirmation of that difference.
Yeah, oh no, absolutely. A question, that just came to mind there actually was, do you think the events of the last year and us becoming far more remote in the way we do business and the way we work, and that I think for a large part is going to stay with us even after COVID is hopefully a long and distant memory. Do you think that's helped in terms of allowing people to be a little bit more open and be a bit more visible, because when they're in that staff meeting, when they're in that team meeting, they're in the comfort of their own homes rather than feeling watched as everyone talks to them?
Yeah, I think yes and no, perhaps. I think one thing is that people have become conscious that their home is now much closer to their work.
Yes.
The background of my office, the photos I have of my family or partner that might be in my office. As an LGBTQ person, you're always thinking about that stuff, right? And so it brings it.
Speaking
in.
of which, there's my dog.
Yeah, exactly. I've loved getting to know all my team's kids, right?
Yeah.
It brings a different. It has brought a different dimension of people's lives to work. It has also been, in many ways, a leveler. I, am a leader of a company based in the United States, in Florida. I lead a team all over the world. I live in the UK. And so it's made people more aware of what it means to be a remote employee. It's made people aware and just disrupted that sense of what our business should be and look like every day. And so I think part of what has fueled a lot of what I think have been really good conversations, obviously the larger political, some of the events outside that have happened. But from an internal work culture perspective, I think that has really helped fuel some of the thinking and conversations that people have had, because it has to be more deliberate. You can't just go to the kitchen and talk to the people you're used to talking to, you're comfortable talking to. You've got to be a little bit more.
You can't just, next time I spot someone in the office, I'll ask them this question. You've got to be proactive in doing it. No, that makes sense. Now, just something came to mind, because I think there's ups and downs of it, isn't there, from a diversity perspective, because you're seeing more of someone's personal life than you otherwise would if they were in the office, which has its good side and its bad sides, because there will be people with more comfortable and less comfortable home situations for working. And, just in terms of being inclusive, I think it's forced a lot of, leaders to actually understand that that's an issue, that's a challenge that they have to help people with. And actually that's kind of what this is all about, because if working remotely and putting that personal work-life balance in people's faces on Zoom calls has done anything, it's helped people understand that actually diversity and inclusion is about everyone. It's not just about specific groups. And I think that's the point of these conversations is, yes, we're talking about LGBTQ plus issues, but that's because, like I said earlier, we're best to start than the community you're part of. But we're all intersections of all of these different kind of categories, or whatever you want to call them.
Absolutely. I mean, to put a specific example of that, if any of my team who are parents felt uncomfortable talking to me about the fact that they have childcare commitments and need to do something, change schedule because of that, I would be horrified, right? I want to have a team and create an environment where people feel like they can support their life and give their best at work every day. That drives performance. And it's consciously having that open-mindedness as a leader to not project what may be your situation onto everybody else's, and to, as an organization, to project what works and what may have been successful in your culture, workplace in the past on your employees. And that's where I think we are seeing this wave of flexibility, if you want to call it that, because guess what? People are different.
Yeah, no, completely. And that's a recognition, I think, that we're getting closer to, achieving, and every business is at a different part of that kind of journey, I suppose. And if putting these conversations out there does nothing apart from help move someone on that little tiny bit further, they've done a good thing. We've touched on it a couple of times, but one thing I wanted to kind of finish up on was that idea of, masculinity, toxic masculinity, if you want to call it that, because I think that's something that isn't just an LGBTQ issue. That's something that affects everybody. And if we're sitting here, like I said before, as two white guys, there's plenty of privilege appearing in this conversation, even though we're talking about, minority issues. That's something I think that delves its way into every part of what we've talked about. And that idea of traditionally male-dominated places almost only having one definition of what male is, ironically, because they've been male this whole time.
Mhm.
Do you feel like actually the diversity, the inclusion conversation is going to help that if it does nothing apart from help people understand that there's different facets to everything, and that as well as sexuality, gender is also on that spectrum, and there isn't a single definition of anything?
Yeah, I mean, who you want to live with, or the gender of that person is no different to what hobbies somebody might have out of work, and whether those are considered okay by classical codes of masculinity, aka toxic codes of masculinity.
Yes.
Coming from Australia and New Zealand, I think over my lifetime, I've seen that awareness of moves from, not every boy wants to play rugby. Not every wants to like girls. And it's these things might sound overly simplified or whatever, but I think it's, again, whether people do that consciously or subconsciously. Right? I know it even happens within the gay community, right? Like, oh my gosh, how could you like football, or how could you like rugby, right? Or friends that in gay rugby teams that play. The things that people say to them, or the assumptions about what that means to who they are as a male. Clearly that's a point that infuriates me a lot. You can be anything you want to be, and therefore being male and the definition of male and maleness is about being open to the fact that it's the things that make us the same that do and will bind us together, but it's recognizing the differences as well that will build stronger and better relationships and as a business.
Oh no, completely. And I mean, I think back to what you said about the team in Derby saying they would beat up anyone that threatened you with anything. That kind of would make me equal parts comfortable and equal parts terrified, because it's part of that. It's a symptom of that kind of issue, isn't it? But funnily enough, I'm saying this as the guy who did play rugby as I was growing up. But then it also reminds me, I play in a metal band. I've been in the metal kind of community, most of my life as well, and that is a hyper masculine, area as well. But at the same time, incredibly inclusive. But it might not look so from the outside. And I think that's something we need to remember with work cultures as well, is that it doesn't mean that something being hyper masculine is bad, because it can be as inclusive as need be for for anyone else. But privilege isn't bad. It's recognizing that it exists that's good.
Exactly, and it goes back to the visible versus invisible part, right?
Yeah.
In a metal band, people may dress in a certain way to create a shared sense of shared identity or shared purpose. At work, we might wear a uniform or a certain set of, you tend to find, for example, in workplaces, people tend to dress to a certain level or expectation. That's an important part of the culture, whether that's casual or more formal. But it's those things that perhaps you don't see and that you therefore don't talk about that are often the more, complex facets of identity for people internally. And whether it's something they're into outside of work, whether it's their personal life, whether it's experiences they've had in the past, and formative experiences. And I think that's to that point around how do you, the kind of, it's not about calling out toxic masculinity. It's not about invalidating it or saying that, that conversation about football is any less important than talking about diversity or something else. But it is about saying that all of these conversations and all of these facets of individuals and team members are equally important or part of that conversation. And I think that one of the things that, that kind of when we refer to toxic masculinity, it is that sense that there is a hierarchy or there is some kind of order of okayness. And I think that is something that in all aspects of privilege, people need to be conscious of.
Yes.
Religion, ethnicity, sexuality, gender, you name it. You see the same modes operating. There's kind of a
no, absolutely. And I think that is a fantastic point to end on, actually. I'm sure, like I said, we could speak for hours and hours on this, and lucky me, I get to speak for hours and hours on this. So thank you for your time, Henry. It's been fantastic. And if anyone, watching, listening, had any questions, feel free. I'm sure you don't mind people reaching out to you. I certainly don't mind people reaching out to me. I'm far from an expert, but we can try and help.
You know what? It's as I said, I think real change is a grassroots thing, and it does start with the individual decisions that we take as leaders, that we take as managers, as individuals, as team members in our personal and professional life. And it's not somebody else's problem to fix. That's, I think, the thing we all have to go to work every day, keeping in mind.
There we go. There's the title for this episode. It's not someone else's problem to fix. I'll quote you on that one.
Anytime.
Excellent. Thanks for your time, Henry.
Pleasure.